Good morning. That was weak, people. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Lynn Rosenthal, and I'm the White House Advisor on Violence Against Women. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the White House. I want to start by saying on behalf of President Obama and Vice President Biden, how much we appreciate the life-saving work that you all do in communities every single day. You've come here today from law enforcement agencies, women's groups, tribes, youth groups, and the faith community, all in support of the Violence Against Women Act. I want to give a special shout out, though, to the members of the National Task Force on Violence Against Women. Could you all stand and let us applaud you for all of your hard work you've been doing? And before we start today's program, I want to welcome two other very special groups of people. Some of you may remember last summer when Vice President Biden and Secretary Sebelius announced our Apps Against Abuse, a challenge to technology innovators to develop new mobile applications to help respond to and prevent abuse. When we issued this challenge, we had no idea what would happen. But frankly, the results have far exceeded our expectations. So I'd like to introduce you today to our two winners. I'd like to ask them to stand, our team from On Watch and our team from Circle of Six. These applications are available on iTunes for download. On Watch is launching its app in conjunction with this event today. So thank you all so much. I was a shelter director in North Florida in 1993 when Congress was debating the Violence Against Women Act. And I remember standing in our broken down 3-bedroom house where we were sheltering 22 women and kids. Women and children who had already experienced unspeakable violence. And I remember standing in this shelter and thinking to myself, after the Violence Against Women Act passes, this will all change. And indeed, it has. So to take us through a conversation today about what the Violence Against Women Act did, and why we still need it today, it's a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce Emmy Award-winning journalist, host, and executive producer of Investigation Discovery, Paula Zahn. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, for that generous introduction, and hello, everybody. Great to see all of you. I am honored to be here today with Vice President Biden, Attorney General Eric Holder, Senior Advisor to the President, Valerie Jarrett, and, of course, my esteemed panel, who you're going to hear from shortly, which has impressed all of us with its dedication to ending violence against women. It is true that tremendous progress has been made since Vice President Biden initiated the hearings on VAWA back in 1991, leading to its ultimate passage in 1994. Unfortunately, there is still much to be done. Domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking continue to pose significant threats to women, families, and communities. The statistics, as you well know out there, are daunting. Domestic violence alone causes 2 million injuries a year and 3 deaths a day to women. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men will be raped at some point in their lifetime. This issue has been particularly important to me and my boss, Henry Schleif of Investigation Discovery, and I'm gratified to see so many members of the press here today. The media plays a very critical role in shining a light on these challenging issues, and I believe also has an obligation to help keep national attention on this societal problem. And now, on to our esteemed panelists, all of whom have dedicated enormous hours and basically sacrificed their lives to bring more attention to this issue. To my left, Anthony Brown, Lieutenant Governor, you could wave your hand for those folks who haven't been introduced to you yet, has been Lieutenant Governor for 6 years, where he leads the state's efforts to address domestic violence. He's a graduate of Harvard Law and is also our nation's highest-ranking elected official to have served a tour of duty in Iraq. Our gratitude for that as well. The Honorable Karen Adam, to the Lieutenant Governor's right, who has been on the bench since 1981 and serves currently as an Arizona senior court judge in Pima County. And then Reverend Dr. Ann Hunter is an ordained United Methodist pastor who received her master's degree in divinity from Harvard University. A lot of Harvard people here today. She also happens to be a survivor of domestic violence and will share her very painful story with us today. Dave Thomas is a retired police officer from Montgomery County, Maryland, and the Domestic Violence Program Administrator in the Division of Public Safety at Johns Hopkins University. And then Devon Boyer is a council member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribe and a former law enforcement officer. We are grateful that you could all join us today. Lieutenant Governor Brown, I'd like to start with you. You have an extremely personal reason for being here today, and one that gives you, I think, a unique perspective as a public servant. And I would love to give you the opportunity to share that part of your story with us now.
Well, thank you, Paula. And let me start by thanking Vice President Biden for bringing us together to refocus our efforts on violence against women and the need to reauthorize this act, an act that 18 years ago he brought together bipartisan support to get the job done. We need to continue to reauthorize it. And I want to also thank each and every one of you for what you do on the front lines. Domestic violence, as you know, knows no borders, no boundaries. There's no community, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, that is immune from domestic violence. And in fact, there's no family that is immune from the risks, the threat, and the potential harm of domestic violence. In August of 2008, my Uncle Howard buried his daughter, my cousin, Kathy. She was killed by her estranged boyfriend, shot in the neck in front of 2 Montgomery County police officers, died instantly, and they in turn took his life. It was needless, it was senseless, and it shouldn't happen anywhere, either in Maryland or throughout this country. That same year, Governor O'Malley and I established as a goal to reduce violence against women by 25%, and the good news is we're about 21%, so we're well along the way, but we still have a lot of work to do, as Paula mentioned. And the progress that we've made is due in large part by the funding and the framework set up by the Violence Against Women Act. And there are a number of things that we've done in Maryland using those funds. And I just want to share 3 of them with you, maybe 2, because I think I only have 3 minutes. But one of them that I've worked a lot with, and with some of you who I recognize in the audience, we've worked together, is to introduce these domestic violence screening and response programs in our hospitals. We have 43 community hospitals. Today, 6 of them, and our goal is to get all 43 online, 6 of them have programs where they train not only providers, but administrators and intake personnel on how to screen for domestic violence, and then importantly, how to connect that person to the needed resources, whether it's housing, employment, or other counseling services. We know, and you know all too often, that someone will present in an emergency department and with lacerations or other injuries and say that I slipped and fell down the steps. And the story behind that is that she was pushed down the steps. But unless you have people that are trained to ask the right questions in a sensitive way, in a probing way, in an appropriate way, we may never get to that. But when we do, we can then begin assisting that person to break the cycle of violence, remove them into a more safer environment, and save lives. And we're doing that each and every day. Look, I've probably already gone my 3 minutes just on that one. There's plenty more that we're doing in Maryland, but we can't do it unless we reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. So thank you very much again to the Vice President, to Valerie Jarrett, and to each of you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Judge Adam, I want to go back in time. You have been sitting on the bench for a very long time. We we won't make you sound really, really old. She's a distinguished jurist here. And I would love for you to share with us what you think some of the key differences are in the legal response to domestic violence pre-VAWA and now that it is currently the law of the land.
Thank you, Paula. I want to thank you also for inviting me to comment on the impact of VAWA on the court, even though it's in 3 minutes. And there's a lot more to say than I can cover it. You are, I know.
I have a little clock in my head. I'm sorry. It's one of the hazards of our industry.
It's a tremendous honor to be on a panel with such distinguished speakers and to be addressing an audience of such committed and passionate people working in the field. You know, judges aren't allowed to comment publicly about legislation unless it's related to the administration of justice, and nothing could be more related to the administration of justice than the Violence Against Women Act, because the administration of justice, fairness, due process, informed decision-making, and equal treatment of all depends on an educated and thoughtful judiciary. Because of VAWA and the extensive and comprehensive training it has provided, judges across the country are enlightened and prepared to deal with domestic violence, one of the most complex issues facing the courts today. I began my career on the bench in 1981 as a city court magistrate and pre-VAWA. The statutes in Arizona about domestic violence and orders of protection had gone into effect the year before, and we were swamped with requests for help. None of us on the bench had any training in the dynamics of domestic violence or what appropriate interventions might be. We were all on a tightrope without a net. In 1987, 3 years after VAWA was implemented, I began a 10-and-a-half-year career on the family law bench. Unlike my city court experience, there were numerous opportunities for us to learn about domestic violence and its impact on the court. Most litigants are self-represented in family law, and there are ample opportunities for an uneven playing field and further complications to an already complex set of issues. With the help of the terrific VAWA-sponsored training through our own judicial education department in Arizona, where, by the way, we had a DV specialist for a while, hired through a VAWA grant to develop curricula, every new judge is trained in domestic violence before taking the bench. Additionally, we have advanced training throughout the year, and some of our training is even web-based to assist our rural judges and other judges who don't have the funds to come to the city of Phoenix, where the training generally occurs. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, of which I'm a member and a former member of the Board of Trustees, provides national training that is unmatched in quality and content. So in general, there is such a wealth of education opportunities available to judges that wasn't available before. And now, 31 years later, as a result of this training, I'm a better judge, a wiser judge, a more thoughtful judge, as are my colleagues on the bench. Whether in family law, juvenile law, child welfare law, criminal law, probate law, landlord-tenant law, bankruptcy, civil law, we know what to look for when DV is alleged, or even when it isn't alleged, but it's likely. We know how to ensure that a case is handled appropriately with everyone's rights protected and know what interventions are most effective. It's always a challenge to balance doing what is right with what is allowed by the law, and judges must always follow the law. Giving them the tools to both understand domestic violence and at the same time work within their ethical bounds is made possible through this VAWA training. And the training that's been available for prosecutors and defense attorneys and victim witness advocates have further strengthened all of these systems. There's more work to be done. I'm now the presiding judge at Pima County Juvenile Court, and we need help in dealing with the impact of domestic violence in child welfare and juvenile justice. We need to better assess and intervene with our abused children, who often go on to become themselves abusers. We need common definitions and cross-system education, and we need appropriate evidence-based treatment for both survivors and perpetrators. I look forward to new research, and from that research, new best practices to implement in our court, and I'm counting on VAWA to help us. Thank you.
Wanted to change the direction of our conversation a little bit now with Reverend Dr. I don't know what to call you. It's kind of intimidating. She's not only Reverend, but she's Dr. Anne. Can I just call you Anne Marie?
Sure, go ahead.
I want to give you the opportunity to share your story with us. You, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was a victim of domestic violence yourself. And your experience is very different, or was very different from what women face today, primarily because of AWA.
Because of AWA. Yes, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you for a little bit, give you a glimpse of what life for a victim of domestic violence looked like before VAWA, so we'll know what a huge difference it's making now. It was actually the late 1970s, 10 years before we started talking about VAWA, really. I was living in a small town in a rural community, and I'd been married for 4 years, and I did not have any language to describe what was happening to me in that marriage, because there weren't words like battered women or domestic violence. I had no idea how to even name what was happening. I knew it was miserable. I believed I was the only one this had ever happened to. And one day, when I was afraid of what my husband might do next, I left. Now this is pre-VAWA, so there was no shelter. I stayed with friends. I had to move every couple of days because my husband would start beating on their doors and calling them incessantly. And finally they would ask me to leave, saying he's dangerous. I finally got an apartment. One night he was pounding on the door and screaming for me to let him in. This is pre-VAWA, so there's no hotline, so I called a friend who encouraged me to call the police. The police came, but because they had not had any training on domestic violence, they walked him around the block and he was back at my doorstep 15 minutes later. I was scared, very scared, but there were no advocates, so I had to make up my own safety plan. So the plan was I put deadbolts on the door of my apartment, the front door, and also on the bedroom door. I had a rope ladder to get out the second floor window. I slept cradling my phone. And the plan was that when he broke in the front door of my apartment, I would call the police and put the ladder out the window and climb down and run, all in the time it took him to get through the bedroom door. And there was no plan for where to run, I realize now. I know where I was going. There were no support groups because it's pre-VAWA, but a friend recommended her therapist, so I went to see her, and she dismissed what was happening sort of blithely, saying, he's Eastern European, they all have terrible tempers. I told my lawyer what was going on, how he had broken into my apartment, he had harassed me at work, he was harassing my friends and family. She suggested I get a court order, and I remember asking her, does that require talking to a judge? And she said yes, and I flat out refused. I was too terrified and too ashamed. He could kill me, as far as I was concerned, before I was going to talk about this in public. It was a very small town, and there were no court advocates to help. Meanwhile, my priest had had a long talk with my husband and then had met with me. He asked me why I'd abandoned my marriage, and he said my husband had had a religious conversion, he was a changed man, I should forgive and go back home. I admitted that I thought that was dangerous, and the priest said I obviously was no longer Christian because I didn't believe in the power of the Holy Spirit to change people. I could go on and on and on, but you get the picture. VAWA has changed everything in the lives of victims. Is it perfect? No. But is it this? No. We've come a long way. I'm now a United Methodist pastor. I have an agency that I founded called Safe Havens, and we receive funding from the Office on Violence Against Women to train faith leaders, so we're no longer saying pray harder and go back home. We're also working to build bridges between faith leaders and service providers and law enforcement and so forth so that we can refer and be actually helpful. Whether it's elder abuse in Cincinnati or sexual violence in rural Alaska or domestic violence in Boston, faith communities can provide a life-saving bridge to information and referrals. But I'm also a mom, and VAWA is important not only to me, but to my children, to your children, to our grandchildren. We all deserve to live secure and free in a world made safer by VAWA. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I now want to move on to the issue of law enforcement and the impact the VAWA has had on that. And Dave Thomas, I wonder if you could share with us what you think are some of the critical changes that have happened as a result of VAWA now being
Yes.
on the books.
I'm really honored to be here with you to address what former Attorney General Janet Reno deemed the root cause of our social ills. You know, when I entered law enforcement in 1986, the standard operating procedure for responding to domestics was to go in, separate the combatants, perhaps get somebody to leave for the night or take a walk around the block, as was mentioned, and get back into service as soon as possible. This was done without so much as taking a report. If there was a question of whether or not to make an arrest, the burden was put upon the shoulders of the victim. Whereas if the crime had been the robbing of a bank, we never asked the bank manager whether or not they wanted the robber arrested. In 1990, I responded to a home that I'd been to many times before. And following our standard operating procedure, I handled the call quickly and went back into service without so much as taking a report. But something about this call, it was different. Something that I couldn't quite articulate kept telling me that the victim was in grave danger. Less than 3 weeks later, we were there again. But this time, as circumstances would unfold, that same victim's estranged husband shot her to death in front of myself and 3 other uniformed officers before we were able to return fire. He then stumbled back into the house and committed suicide. With the passing of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, a sea change began. The Violence Against Women Act was responsible for an infusion of funding for domestic violence response, education, and training. Slowly but surely, things began to change. Officers began to receive adequate training and thus make effective self-defense and predominant aggressor determinations. On-scene arrest increased, as did calls for service, which is a positive because citizens began to realize that now when we come out, the law won't stop at the doorstep. In Maryland, these efforts have included the implementation of the lethality assessment program that was alluded to by the Lieutenant Governor. It was put in throughout the state, and this was a program in which local service providers and local law enforcement collaborate to reduce homicide. Our average count of domestic violence homicide was 69 for 25 years running. This was a statistic that I was painfully aware of since that tragic day in 1990 when the victim I mentioned earlier was slain before my eyes. It was clear that something needed to be done. One of the alarming things that we found when we were coming up with this program was that in a large number of homicide cases in Maryland as well as throughout the country, victims never sought or were afforded services. Thus, one of our major goals was to better connect victim to services, and the history speaks for itself. Over the past years, as the degree of participation statewide has increased, Maryland has seen a corresponding double-digit decrease in the domestic violence intimate homicide rate, from 56 in 2008 to 27 in 2011. The Violence Against Women Act inspired changes that I've seen in the last 26 years since I raised my hand and swore an oath that are truly dramatic. Although the numerous gains in the movement forward in some areas of the country is impressive, it's just not enough. We have seen a great deal of progress, yet there is much more to be done to ensure that every citizen is afforded their rights, and we are able to make the law keep its promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. One of the probably most unreported tragedies that you see buried in this overall issue is the disproportionate number of Native women who are affected by domestic violence. And I wanted to give Devin now a chance to talk about that and start off with a very specific question. What are some of the challenges, the jurisdictional challenges you have when it comes to domestic violence?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Honored to be here today, not only for Shoshone-Bannock tribes of Idaho, but for all tribes in the United States, this country. The percentages are almost 50-50, the amount of women that are abused in one form or another. Our culture and our belief dictates that women are held next to the Creator because they're able to give life, and that's why you have mothers and grandmothers, and in our language, the grandmothers are called zozos. And so we honor them throughout their lifetime. I'm also the father of 3 young daughters myself. And so with this belief and this custom and this practice, when it comes to the rapes and the deaths and the stalking and all the things that are caused from violence against women, it doesn't make sense to us. We don't understand. And so when non-members that are non-tribal members commit crimes on our reservations where we stay and live, and the fact is we're helpless because they're non-members. We have no way of prosecuting them. Now there is some folks that we have the ability to take to perhaps our United States district courts in each state, but even at that, at best they may get a few years and maybe a fine. Now in my past, in my history as a law enforcement officer for 14 years practicing law enforcement, there was a lot of things that happened. I'll give you just 2 short stories. The first one, I drove through a housing complex and found a young gal that I'd met probably a week earlier by some friends of mine that had brought their relative to our reservation. And I found her laying in the snow. It was wintertime. And she was laying in a snowbank and her body was blue. And it's hard to see brown skin such as mine blue. And she did survive, but unfortunately the violators were non-tribal members and were never prosecuted. Another thing that happened for recently, a young girl was, her other half happens to be a non-tribal member, which he decided to rape his other half one evening. And so he took a baseball bat to the back of her head, and her brains were exposed. And when that crime was stopped by family members, fortunately, when it went to United States District Court for prosecution, the individual got time served with a small fine. So the problems that we have is we have no local control over crimes when it comes to non-members and our women being the victims. So what we're asking for is not only for everything that we've stated today at this panel, but we're asking for some local control, because if a crime is a crime, no matter where it's committed, especially against women. And that's the things that we're looking at today.
Thank you, Devin. I wanted to thank all of you for sharing your time with us today, sharing your heartfelt stories with us, sharing your passion with us. And I think as reauthorization is being debated on the Hill, based on what we have heard from our panelists today, there is clear and compelling evidence that the Violence Against Women Act has changed people's lives for the better, from the entire way these crimes have been dealt with, from law enforcement practices to the awareness of clergy, to the capacity of judges to understand these cases. Domestic violence has dropped by more than 60% since VAWA has been passed, but I think we all acknowledged that there's a lot more work to be done. And I wanted to applaud all of you out there for what you are doing in your respective professional lives as you're trying to make families safer and women safer. And I think now the rest of us have to continue to do our part to raise awareness of this critical issue. So thank you all for your time, your dedication, your interests, and your commitment to this extremely important and challenging fight.
Thank you so much, Paula, and to all of our panelists. You told the story that we needed to be told. But in spite of all we've heard in many cases about success, I also know that somewhere today around the country, a woman has been raped by her neighbor and had to flee her house in the middle of the night and had nowhere to go. I know that a young man who was sexually abused as a child caught up his courage to finally call a rape crisis center only to find a waiting list for services. And I know that somewhere a college student is being stalked by an abusive ex-boyfriend, and she's scared and she feels very much alone. So in spite of what we've heard today about the success of the Violence Against Women Act, we know that there is so much more yet to do. So to take us through the second part of our program, it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of the White House Council on Women and Girls and the senior advisor to President Obama, Valerie Jarrett.
Well, good morning, everyone. Lynn, thank you for that introduction. Lynn, don't go away, because I'm going to say something nice about you. I mean, my goodness, this is the first time we've ever in the White House had a point person whose sole job is to focus on ending violence against women. And so please join me in recognizing the fabulous work that Lynn does. All right, you can leave now if you want to, but I wanted you to at least hear the shout out. I also want to recognize the tremendous panel, and as Paula said, it's so important that we all put a face on the stories and that the media is here to really see what the impact of VAWA has done on the lives of so many people across the country. Indeed, we have a long way to go, but as you heard, what life was like before VAWA was enacted, and so it's so important that it's reauthorized. As chair of the White House Council on Women and Girls, I'm particularly proud to serve in this administration. Tone starts at the top, and we are so fortunate to have both a president and a vice president who are so deeply and personally committed to ending violence against women and girls and boys and men. But I'm also here as a mom of an adult daughter, a young adult daughter, of course. I thought that went without saying, but just in case it didn't. And there's just nothing more important to me, obviously, than her well-being. And all across our country, there are children, parents, grandparents, siblings, cousins, friends, and neighbors who have suffered from domestic violence. No family or community is immune, and we've seen all too often the devastating impact on the lives of too many. While we have an extraordinary gathering here today of frontline providers, law enforcement officers, policymakers, and people whose lives have been deeply touched by violence, we all wish there was no need to be here at all. While we have made tremendous progress, too many women and girls, boys and men, still experience domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. VAWA has made it possible for victims of these crimes to seek justice. VAWA has also extended, as you heard earlier in the panel, beyond the criminal justice system to help victims find housing, improve health care response to violence, and engage in community prevention. We all look forward to the day when prevention, intervention, and education have put an end to abuse once and for all. But until then, the Violence Against Women Act is one of the most critical tools we have to eradicate these horrible crimes. Just a couple of weeks ago, we held a forum here on women in the economy, and one of the breakout sessions was on domestic violence. Why? Because obviously, when women or men come to work and they've been victims of domestic violence, it affects their productivity in the workplace. It doesn't stop as you enter the doors of your office. And we were fortunate that our Attorney General, Eric Holder, was on hand to help with Lynn moderating the panel discussion we had on the effect of violence against women in the workplace. So I have to tell you, I've known Eric Holder for quite a while now, and we are so fortunate to have somebody heading our Justice Department who doesn't just administer and enforce the law, but who cares so deeply and personally about this issue. And so having him at the helm does an enormous amount to improve the quality of life for all of our citizens. And so I would ask you to join me in welcoming a very strong advocate for VAWA and somebody who takes this charge quite personally, the Attorney General for the United States, Eric Holder. Thank you.
Good. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Good morning. This is interesting. There are a teleprompter here, but those are not my remarks, so I guess this is for somebody else. Don't worry, I have mine right here. Thank you, Valerie, for your kind words and for the outstanding work that you and Lynn Rosenthal, and so many of your colleagues here at the White House are doing on behalf of women and girls all across the country who need, deserve, and who are depending on our help. Now, it really is an honor for me to be able to join with all of you and with this group of policy experts, frontline practitioners, service providers, and dedicated and courageous advocates like Dr. Anne Marie Hunter and Sharon Love, as we call for the legislative action, and the continued bipartisan congressional leadership that is necessary to better protect women and girls from violence, from abuse, and from exploitation. I want to thank each of our speakers and panelists for lending your voices to this work and for sharing your concerns as well as your remarkable stories with us. Now, I'd also like to recognize the law enforcement officials, the community leaders, school association representatives, local, state, and tribal advocates, and congressional staffers who are here with us this morning. Through your partnership in implementing and enforcing the landmark Violence Against Women Act over the past 2 decades, and your leadership in working to refine and finally to reauthorize this critical law, you've helped to improve and to even save countless lives. Now, recent statistics show that between 1993, the year before then Senator Joe Biden authored this transformative legislation, and 2010, between 1993 and 2010, the number of women killed by an intimate partner declined by 30%. And annual rates of domestic violence against women plummeted by 2/3. Now, these statistics are extraordinary. They speak to the effectiveness, I think, of this important law and to the immense power of the critical partners gathered here today in strengthening the criminal justice response to violence against women, in improving access to essential services for victims of these crimes, and in directly combating a problem that is so widespread that one study suggests it affects roughly 1 in 4 women and 1 in 13 men at some point during their lifetimes. Now, as a former judge, I've seen the consequences that violence against women can have on neighborhoods and on families, and especially and most tragically on young people. As a former United States attorney for the District of Columbia, I helped formulate an aggressive response by establishing a domestic violence unit within my office and enlisting the help of law enforcement officers and community leaders to address these crimes throughout our nation's capital. And today, as Attorney General, but also as the father of 2 teenage girls, this work for me remains both a professional and personal priority. And for our nation's Department of Justice, vigorously enforcing the provisions of the Violence Against Women Act is part of our solemn commitment to the citizens that we are very privileged to serve. In many ways, fulfilling this commitment has never been more urgent. Estimates show that more than 2 million adults and more than 15 million children are exposed to domestic violence every single year. Now, in addition to its devastating human toll, in purely economic terms, domestic violence costs our nation $8 billion annually in lost productivity and in health care costs. In fact, it is responsible for the loss of 8 million paid days of work each year, or the equivalent of 32,000 full-time jobs. But we can all be encouraged that over the past 3 years, the Obama administration has taken bold, innovative, and collaborative steps to more effectively prevent and prosecute violence against women and girls, and to help victims seek justice, and to rebuild their lives. For example, in January of this year, we took important, and I think really long overdue action when the department amended the Uniform Crime Report's definition of rape. The revised definition, which is used by the FBI to collect information from local law enforcement agencies about reported rapes, now includes non-vaginal forms of penetration, It incorporates male victims, and by providing us with more complete data, will enable us to more effectively combat and prevent these devastating crimes. In addition to calling for this revision, the Justice Department has also focused on and worked to raise awareness about the alarming rates of domestic violence in tribal communities, where violent crime rates are now 2, 4, and in some cases 10 times the national average. Now, the status quo is quite simply unacceptable, and that's why the Justice Department has proposed legislation, which is included in the VAWA reauthorization bill, that would close significant legal gaps and give Indian country law enforcement officials, investigators, and prosecutors the tools that they need to crack down on violence against women and girls. This would build on the outstanding efforts led by the Department's Office of Violence Against Women, which has been on the front lines of the administration's commitment to protecting the rights and the safety of women and girls nationwide. Since 2009, OVW has awarded a record number of grants totaling more than $1.5 billion to states, territories, local and tribal governments, and nonprofit organizations in order to launch, sustain, and strengthen activities related to combating violence against women. Now, these investments have supported a wide variety of critical efforts, from initiatives aimed at preventing teen dating violence and sexual assaults to improving the reporting of these crimes, reducing the backlog of rape kits, and building the capacity of tribal courts to combat domestic violence. And several OVW programs support initiatives and organizations that, by providing women with job training, financial literacy training, and housing services, have already had a very clear economic impact. But as everyone here knows, we have more to do. We have a lot more to do as we look towards the future and as Congress moves to consider reauthorizing this critical law. And for the life of me, I cannot begin to understand why this is something that is a debate within Congress. This is a statute that has had bipartisan support over the years, and it is inconceivable to me now that we are in the process of a debate about something that has proven so effective and is clearly so needed for the future. It must be passed, and it must be passed soon. But as we consider the reauthorization of this law, it's important to remember that none of the progress that we are gathered to discuss and to advance has been inevitable. None of this is inevitable. It has resulted from the work of committed advocates like Vice President Biden, whose vision first drove Congress to pass, and President Clinton to sign this historic law. It has been extended by policymakers like Senator Harry Reid, Senator Pat Leahy, Senator Mike Crapo, who are fighting tirelessly to secure its timely reauthorization. And it is being realized by Justice Department leaders, administration officials, law enforcement officers, community activists, victim advocates, and brave survivors like those who are gathered here today. So as you continue this work, I want you to know that this administration, and in particular, this Department of Justice, will do all that we can to support you. We are grateful for your leadership, we are grateful for your very hard work, and we are very proud to stand by your side. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. One of the things the Attorney General has really done is taken the work in the Department of Justice beyond the Office of Violence Against Women to a whole of department approach, which has really set a leadership tone within the federal government. So another round of applause for the Attorney General. We're going to take a very short break, but we ask you to stay in your seats. And then Valerie will start us back up in just a couple of minutes. So thank you for just holding for a couple of minutes.
So now I have the honor of introducing an extraordinarily brave woman. In May of 2010, Sharon Love's daughter, Yeardley, a University of Virginia senior, was murdered by her ex-boyfriend. In February of 2012, Yeardley's ex-boyfriend was convicted of second-degree murder. Yeardley's tragic death is every parent's worst nightmare. And it demonstrates the horrible reality that dating violence can happen to anybody. Yeardley was an amazing young woman, a star of her lacrosse team, by all accounts, an extraordinarily generous person who was always reaching out to help everyone. Her death affected us here at the White House very deeply, as well as many of you here and across the country. And it further renewed our commitment to ending dating violence once and for all. No family should have to face what Sharon and her family have had to face. Her precious daughter, a young woman who was full of light and promise, taken from her so young. No young woman should have to fear that ending a relationship could mean the end of her life. Sharon and her daughter Lexi, with incredible courage, have started the One Love Foundation in Yeardley's memory. I met Sharon backstage before we began, and I said, "What's your goal?" And she said, "I want to make sure that violence against women is turned upside down, and that it's no longer acceptable. It's no longer that people just look the other way and accept it." She analogized it to the efforts, the campaign against smoking, and how on an airplane several years ago you could sit on a plane and everybody smoked and it was just accepted. And now it's not. And so she also said it gives her strength to be able to honor her daughter in a way that she thinks will save other people's daughters. So please join me in warmly welcoming Sharon Love.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Take a deep breath. You're going to be great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for such a nice introduction, too. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to look out and see so many people here today sharing the same aspirations and goals. Domestic violence has shattered so many lives and will continue to do so until we stand united and say no more. My daughter was murdered almost 2 years ago at the University of Virginia by an out-of-control lacrosse player with a violent past. Our lives will never be the same. If it wasn't for the support of family, friends, and even total strangers, I can't imagine where we would be today. We'll be forever grateful for the kindness, these acts of kindness that so many people showed us during this time. Vice President Biden chose to reach out to my daughter Lexi and I at the most difficult time of our lives. He too had experienced a devastating personal loss, and because of this, we shared an understanding that goes beyond words. Vice President Biden not only offered us compassion, support, and invaluable advice, but also proof that life goes on. As hard as it is to realize that nothing will bring Yeardley back to us, that same realization is our driving force to keep her memory alive. We created the One Love Foundation in order to do just that. In our quest to end violence against women, we recently began collaborating with top domestic violence experts at Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School for Public Health and School of Nursing. We plan to develop the necessary tools and educational components to address domestic violence at its core. We are very optimistic that with a concerted effort, we can make a difference not only in people's behaviors, but also their attitudes. The Violence Against Women Act was the very first step on the road to ending this devastating problem. It is my hope that we will continue this journey together until we reach this goal. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you the architect of the Violence Against Women Act, my friend, Vice President Biden.
Hey, everybody, how are you? General, please sit down. Thank you all so very much. Please sit down. Thank you so much. It's great to be with so many people that I agree with. It's a nice feeling in this town when that happens, I tell you. And this is an issue that, at least in the past, has crossed party lines. This is an issue that has been something that I, at least I hoped and thought, General, that we're beyond questioning the need for the Violence Against Women Act. I can remember as vividly as it was yesterday, when way back in the 80s, I, as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, got a report from what the General will tell you is called the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And I saw that while violence crime against men in this period, we all talked about violent crime and the effect of cocaine and all these things about and crack and how gratuitous violence was manifesting itself in ways we hadn't seen. That although violent crime, I thought, was rising relative to everyone, it was actually trending down for men. It was trending down for young men between the ages of 18 and 30 even. But violent crime, according to statistics, was actually up as it related to women over the same period of time. And I can remember thinking to myself, how in God's name is that, how do you explain that? And literally, as some of you in this audience who were with me, or I should say I was with you from the beginning, we actually resolved we were going to do something, we're going to find out why, and we're going to do something about it. Without boring you with the journey that took us to the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, I can tell you how we went about it. And I think it's important in order to figure how we go from here. I went about it by first getting people to acknowledge that there was a problem. Now, it's kind of hard to believe, but the biggest issue back then in the early 80s was their willingness to recognize this is a problem. Remember when you came and testified? That this was a problem. Folks on the left and the right and the center, the one thing I was convinced of, all had to acknowledge first and foremost, before we do anything, that this is a problem. I argued it was a crisis. Because once people acknowledge in our society that a problem exists, then right-minded people, almost regardless of their political disposition, right-minded people will decide how to figure out what to do about the problem, to do something about it. But it really was first, is there a problem? And that's when the next phase of the journey took place. Rather than attempting to do everything that at least I thought we should do about the problem, as chairman, I decided that it was more important to have a unified Congress and a unified nation on the issue than it was to have the perfect bill. Because there were certain things I remember sitting with, as some will remember, with old Strom Thurmond and saying, literally, look, on this issue, you have to acknowledge there's a problem. Let's agree on what we can agree on to begin the journey to fight the problem, and then we'll go back and fight later about what else has to be done about the problem. Because I know from experience, and unfortunately I have a great deal of experience in the Congress, I know that if you try to do it all, you don't generate a consensus. And the single most important thing is for us to have a cultural consensus that this is a god-awful problem. And so, although from the beginning, as I said, I knew and many of you knew that we had to do something about dating violence or helping victims find long-term housing, for instance, I thought it was more important to establish the principle as a matter of law. Because I had guys saying to me in the Congress, okay, you're right about that, but I'm not going to raise taxes for housing money. I said, okay, no problem. No problem. Just join me in acknowledging the extent of the problem and deal with the core. And quite frankly, it was also a matter of our civic culture. That no woman should be victimized purely because someone else had more physical power or more economic power. Now, all of you just take that for granted now. But remember back when we started holding those hearings, remember how many times I was told by folks, particularly very conservative folks on the right, religious folks, this is a family matter? This is not a national problem? It's interfering with our family values? I thought that was an interesting one. But it was a big deal. But the core principle I wanted, and I think all of you who worked with me back then wanted to establish was, as a matter of law, as a matter of our culture, as a matter of societal value, no one, as my father would say, that the cardinal sin of all sins was the abuse of power. He used to say this is the ultimate abuse of power. Many of you were my allies in that effort. Many of you really dedicated, brilliant folks in law enforcement. But people don't remember, law enforcement was a great supporter here. Religious groups and women's groups. And I say it all the time, but I want to thank Ellie again and again and again and again, because there was a coalition of those groups that I just described who didn't want to support the bill at first. Not because they were against it, but because they thought there were other priorities. And I'll never forget going around my conference table, and Ellie finally looked and said, "What are we doing here?" Remember that? Why aren't we supporting this? And it changed everything. It changed everything. It's not that people were against it. They just didn't think it was the priority. And guess what? It worked. Particularly those of you who are providers, you know it worked. It worked in that it began to become part of our culture. It became part of our criminal justice culture. Police departments and prosecutors began to approach these cases very differently in order to hold abusers accountable and to make services available to support those who were being abused and those going through what used to be a double abuse of having to go into a trial system, into a court system where they'd be abused once again by the system. It became part of our social fabric, our social culture. And the young women were beginning to be taught affirmatively in the public airways, in their homes by their parents, that they were entitled as a matter of right to be free of abuse, that no boy, no man had any right, under any circumstances, for any reason other than self-defense, to raise his hand to a girl or a woman. None. None. No matter what she was wearing, no matter what advance she may have made, that no means no means no. It means no at a bar, it means no in a bedroom, it means no in the street. The culture began to change. It also became part of our political culture in that it gained acceptance, wide acceptance, when the act became law in '94. You had for the first time American corporations who prior to this would say, when you came in with a black eye, you saw I ran into the door jamb. Everybody in the office knew. Your husband beat you again or your boyfriend beat you. You were ashamed to say anything. And they were afraid to acknowledge it because they didn't want your boyfriend coming into the office. They didn't want your husband coming in the office. But they stepped up. Kodak, DuPont, I can name the major corporations. So the culture began to change. But maybe most importantly, the partisan political culture began to change. Although only 7 Republicans voted for this the first time around, second time around, overwhelmingly, Democrats and Republicans supported it. And so the next time the legislation came around for reauthorization, once it was clear that we weren't threatening anybody, that we weren't undoing the family fabric, that we weren't threatening anybody except the people who threatened women, we were able to go further to refine the law, which we knew from the beginning needed further refinement. We were able to add the definition of dating violence and new transitional housing program. which we couldn't have gotten done the first time. And then, on the third authorization, as this took deeper root, we were able to add training for healthcare providers and programs to help children who were witnessing violence at home and get them psychiatric and psychological help. We were able to refine the law because people became confident that this wasn't a tool by the left or a tool by others to seek somehow advantage in relationships. We were able to refine it when the warnings from the former Chief Justice and the Judicial Conference warned when the bill was being debated. I remember them warning me as chairman and warning the world that if Biden's domestic violence law passes, women will use this as leverage in divorce cases. Bizarre. And by the way, if you wonder whether it's important to have women on the federal bench, guess what? A woman from the Third Circuit in Pennsylvania got other women at the conference who were judges and said, this is malarkey. And it changed. It matters. Perspective matters. So folks, there's a consensus now in America around our daughters, our sisters, our wives, our mothers, our grandmothers, having the right to expect to be free from violent behavior, particularly the most damaging of all physical violence is at the hand of someone you know, the hand of someone you trusted, at the hand of someone that forces you to say to yourself, this must be partially my fault. Why didn't I know this? Some of you counselors out there know. Recovery from stranger rape is about 5 times faster than recovery from rape that occurs or abuse occurs at the hands of someone you know. Because you blame yourself. That's part of the sick part of our culture. No one any longer is making the argument that it's a violation of family values. As a matter of fact, it's become sort of a new definition of what constitutes part of a family value, an American family value. But here the irony of all ironies is I'm standing before you after 36 years in the Senate as Vice President of the United States with, I mean this sincerely, with the Attorney General being kind enough, along with the President, to continue to give me authority over choosing who runs these offices. And I mean, this is a generous guy. I'm serious. I don't think it's ever happened before. But that I thought, if you told me that I'd be standing here in 2012, when the law has been in existence over 17 years, when tens of thousands of women and girls have been helped, when police departments now investigate these crimes and put offenders behind bars in almost every instance, when the annual rates of domestic violence have dropped by more than 60%, when states have moved independently and passed over 700 laws among the 50 states to protect victims and hold offenders accountable. When we set up a national hotline that has answered more than 2 million crisis calls and still responds to more than 23,000 calls every month. And go listen. If you have a chance, they'd love to have you come. Go down to the site and listen to that call. They'll put it on a speaker for you. Hello? Hello? I can't speak. My name's Mary. The last one I heard. I'm in this, I forget the mall, it was in Minneapolis. I'm in such and such a mall. I'm standing between. Oh my God, he's come, oh my God. I'm standing between Gap and, oh my God, I see him coming. $23,000 calls like that in some version come in every single month. And by the way, imagine the courage it takes to pick up the phone. Just think for acceptance, all you guys, just think for a second. The courage it takes to pick that phone up and dial the number. When we help victims find safe places to stay so they wouldn't have to choose between living on the street or living with someone who is going to continue to hurt them and abuse them. When all that has occurred, the idea we're still fighting about this in the Congress, that this is even a debatable issue, is truly sad. It's not a reflection on the law, it's a reflection on our inability in this town to deal with something that by now should just be over in terms of the debate about it. So the reason I took you through this journey, my purpose here today is to remind everyone just how widely accepted, important, and necessary this law is. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but for the press to hear, what are we arguing about? This shouldn't be hard. As recently as 2003, the last poll I could find, when women were asked what they care about most, 92% of American women said reducing domestic violence and sexual assault should be a top priority in America. 92%. I couldn't find a more recent poll, but I would be willing to bet you anything. There's one in 2012. The numbers would not have changed. And look, this is a never-ending fight. You all know this better than I do. And we're still refining, still improving. There's still a lot of work to do. The latest version of the Violence Against Women Act, and Pat Leahy deserves a great deal of credit. The latest version of the act includes help. I realize I've been a pain in the neck about this, but help for schools and colleges to deal with dating violence, since girls in the early 20s face the highest rates of abuse of any women in America. It's going to help law enforcement screen for domestic risk factors that we know lead to domestic violence homicides. And that's going to save lives. And it's going to give police and prosecutors more tools and training to build cases when a victim and the offender know each other, which still remains the most difficult place where we've made the least progress, but the least progress is where women are victimized by acquaintances or friends. We're also refining, but we shouldn't be arguing about the core issue of whether or not we should reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. This has now become, and I would argue proudly, part of the redefinition of our culture. We become identified with this around the world. I travel as much as, I think the only person who's traveled more than me is Secretary Clinton. I've traveled over 580,000 miles so far, literally. And I've had the honor of meeting every head of state of consequence in the world. I meet with civic groups in other countries. As much progress as you all know we have to make on women's issues, they look to us. We're trying to export this philosophy to nations where daughters and wives are still victimized. Every day, women still suffer unimaginable horrors across the world, so-called honor killings, acid attacks, dowry-related murders, genital mutilation. We shouldn't be having this debate. And if anyone thinks that this is no longer relevant, and I know none of you do, just look at Sharon. Look at what she went through. My God. This woman has incredible courage. We talked during the trial. I couldn't imagine, Sharon. You had to sit through every detail. You had to relive every day in court. But I'm confident you go to bed at night and pray is purged from your memory. Every day, every detail. You should take some comfort, kiddo, from one thing. You've given solace, strength, hope, and resolve to tens of thousands of other people in this country. But I got to admit to you frankly, I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it. But you did it. And you wonder whether or not this law is necessary. You don't, but some people apparently do. So folks, we think this law is relevant as relevant today as it was the day we passed it. That's why, in addition to pushing this reauthorization, we independently, because it's within our administration's power with the leadership of the President and Attorney General, we've independently, because he can't wait, changed once and for all the definition of rape so that all victims who report this brutal violation are counted in our nation's crime statistics and get help. That's why, without going to Congress, we beefed up Title IX so the colleges and universities know it's their responsibility to help bring an end to sexual assault on campuses, and they can't hide it. We expanded the National Dating Abuse Helpline so teens and young adults can reach out through the internet and text messaging, the way they communicate, to get help from peers and access to help. And today, the President is directing federal agencies to help employees who are being abused with work for federal agencies to prevent domestic violence in the workplace so that we become a model. Ladies and gentlemen, we're doing this because we know that domestic violence doesn't stay in the home. It spills into the office, the street, it's everywhere. So folks, the core question in my view is the law still needed? Is it still relevant? And if it is, and the answer seems to me it's absolutely clear that it is, just ask 1 million women who are raped every year, 23,000 women and girls who call the domestic violence hotline. Just ask the young woman in high school or college who still faces the highest rate of dating abuse in the country. Just ask the woman who's beaten right before getting up to go to work and then followed to her job by the man who beat her or threatened her. Nobody should question whether this is needed. But here's what's at stake now. It's not just whether or not we reauthorize this. And I mean this, I feel as strongly about this as anything I have felt on this issue. But these guys don't get. It would have been bad had the law never been passed. But imagine now the message it sends if it's not reauthorized. Just ask yourself, what message will be sent to every one of our daughters, every woman imprisoned in her own home? Just ask yourself what it would say to them if the law is not reauthorized. What would it say to our daughters, our wives, our mothers, about whether or not they are entitled to respect and their government believes they're entitled to be free of this violence? About whether or not they're entitled merely because they were born. They were entitled to be free of violence and abuse. Folks, this wasn't the end I ever envisioned with the passage of this legislation. I envision the ultimate result of this legislation, the Supreme Court got in the way in taking away the civil right cause of action in federal court. But I envision this legislation as refinements, that it would lead to be a basis on which we could teach our daughters and our sons that it's absolutely, positively, socially unacceptable to engage in behavior that threatens, condones, or turns a blind eye to physical abuse. That's how ultimately we're going to end this abuse. That's how we'll meet the goal that every single solitary woman and girl in America is entitled to be free of abuse of any kind. It's a fundamental shift in attitude. The moral disapprobation of society is the only thing that ultimately changes behavior, in my view. And just imagine the impact on the moral disapprobation of society if this Congress refuses to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. You know, I thank you all for being here. Not just today, but I look out and I see an awful lot of friends. An awful lot of you taught me a great deal. I thought I came to this fight equipped, and I thought I knew a great deal about it. And I think I did, but you taught me so much more. Some of you heard me say there's nothing in my career, my public life or private life, I've been more proud to be associated with than with all of you in this effort to deal with, as my father would say, the cardinal sin of all sins, the abuse of power. I think we have to appeal to the better angels of our friends up on the Hill. I mean it sincerely. Because I believe, even those guys and women opposing this, I think in their hearts, they know this is the right thing. And so I ask you, in addition to what you're already doing, the groups you represent, appeal to their better angels. Remind them. Remind them some of them have daughters. They have spouses. They have significant others. And this matters. Dealing with this issue is one woman, one girl, one person at a time. It's not about big numbers. It is the quintessential personal issue. And every single case is different. But every case is similar in one respect. If you are victimized, somebody is abusing a physical or financial or psychological power over you. That is the ugliest sin that man can commit. So folks, I think I'm always referred to as, the Attorney General can tell you at cabinet meetings and other places, the White House optimist. I am an optimist because I believe that history of the journey of this country has been, it has always moved toward personal freedom. Always. It's sometimes slid back, but it's always moved forward. So with the help of Valerie Jarrett and the Attorney General's office and leaders like all of you, I'm confident that if we just keep people's eye on the ball, we'll be able to get this done. But it is an irony that a law that overwhelmingly has worked is now being questioned whether or not it should be reauthorized. We can't let that happen. With your help, I don't think it will happen. And for all of you who are providers, all of you who are involved with caring for and intervening on behalf of and helping the women out there, all you law enforcement officers, all you folks running the shelters, all you folks who are engaged in the nursing profession, and doctors who have become much more attuned. So I want to say thank you. My mom used to have an expression. If she were here, she'd look at y'all and say, "You're doing God's work." You really are doing God's work. Thanks an awful lot. See y'all later.